The strangest legends often begin with the names people laugh at. The Marine Corps Museum sat in the center of the base like a quiet keeper of memories. Sunlight filtered through tall glass windows, reflecting off polished display cases filled with faded photographs, old uniforms, and artifacts from generations of service. Visitors moved slowly through the exhibits. Some stopped to read plaques. Others pointed at historic images mounted along the walls. The building carried a unique silence, the kind that always seemed to exist wherever history lived. Walter Hayes stood near a large black and white photograph taken decades earlier. At 83 years old, he looked like a man nobody would notice twice. His gray hair was neatly combed beneath an old Marine Corps cap. His weathered hands rested comfortably in the pockets of a faded jacket. He studied the photograph with calm concentration, as though searching for something only he could see. Nearby, a group of Marines toured the museum during a leadership event. Their conversations echoed lightly through the exhibit hall. Captain Ethan Brooks led the group. At 31, he carried himself with the easy confidence of a Marine officer who had earned respect quickly and expected to keep earning more. He enjoyed history. He enjoyed stories. Most of all, he enjoyed meeting veterans. Usually those meetings came with dramatic tales, colorful nicknames, and memories people loved to share. Ethan noticed the old man standing alone beside the photograph. Something about him suggested military experience. The posture, the haircut, the way his eyes moved across the display. Ethan walked over with a friendly smile. Several Marines followed behind him. "Beautiful piece of history, isn't it?" Ethan asked. Walter nodded. "It is." The captain glanced at the photograph, then back at the old veteran. "Marine?" Walter smiled faintly. "A long time ago." Ethan laughed. "That still counts." A few Marines nearby nodded in agreement. The conversation felt casual, comfortable. Exactly the sort of exchange that happened every day in places like this. Ethan folded his arms and looked around the museum. "You know, every veteran I meet has a story." Walter remained focused on the photograph. "Most do." Ethan grinned. "And every story comes with a call sign." Several Marines chuckled. Walter finally looked at him. His pale blue eyes were calm and surprisingly alert. "Not every story." Ethan pointed playfully. "Come on. Please do not tell me your call sign was something ridiculous." More laughter followed. One Marine suggested names under his breath. Another shook his head with a smile. Walter looked at the photograph again. For a moment, he seemed to consider whether the question deserved an answer at all. Then he gave a small shrug. "JUICEBOX." The reaction was immediate. Laughter erupted throughout the group. One Marine nearly choked on his coffee. Another covered his face. Ethan himself laughed harder than anyone. "No way." Walter nodded. "Way." Ethan wiped a tear from the corner of his eye. "JUICEBOX." The words sounded even funnier the second time. "That was your call sign?" Walter's expression never changed. "It was." The Marines exchanged amused looks. Some repeated the name quietly to themselves. Others laughed again. In a building filled with legendary names and famous battles, JUICEBOX sounded completely out of place. Ethan shook his head in disbelief. "Sir, I have heard some strange call signs before, but that one wins." Walter simply smiled. There was no embarrassment in his face. No frustration. No need to defend himself. He looked perfectly comfortable standing beside a photograph older than most people in the room, while an entire group of Marines laughed at a name that seemed impossible to take seriously. And somehow, that calmness only made the mystery deeper. The laughter lingered long after the word had been spoken. Marines repeated it under their breath as if saying it again might somehow make more sense. It never did. Walter Hayes stood quietly beside the photograph, while Captain Ethan Brooks continued smiling. The names simply refused to fit the image in front of them. Nothing about the old Marine suggested a call sign that sounded like something found in an elementary school lunchbox. Ethan shook his head and laughed again. "I am sorry, sir, but that is incredible." Walter nodded. "That is one word for it." Several Marines nearby chuckled. One of them leaned closer. "Please tell me there is a good story behind that." Another Marine grinned. "There has to be." Ethan pointed toward Walter. "Exactly. Nobody ends up with a name like that without doing something memorable." The old veteran glanced back at the photograph on the wall. The image showed a group of young Marines standing shoulder to shoulder beneath a bright sky from another era. The black and white picture had faded with time, but the expressions remained clear. Determined. Focused. Young. Walter studied it for a few seconds before answering. Most stories sound less impressive when they are explained. Ethan laughed. Now I definitely want to hear it. More Marines gathered nearby. The museum was large, but curiosity had a way of pulling people toward the same place. Visitors passing through the exhibit slowed their pace. Some pretended to study displays while quietly listening. Walter seemed completely unaware of the attention, or perhaps he simply did not care. Ethan folded his arms. Come on. You cannot drop a call sign like that and walk away. Walter smiled faintly. I already did. The response earned another round of laughter. Yet something about the old man's calm confidence made the joke feel different now. He was not trying to be mysterious. He was not performing for an audience. He simply seemed uninterested in explaining himself. That fact bothered Ethan far more than he expected. Usually veterans enjoyed sharing stories. Usually they appreciated the chance to talk about the past. Walter Hayes looked like a man who had spent decades doing the opposite. One of the younger Marines tilted his head. So what did it mean? Walter shrugged. It made sense at the time. Ethan pointed toward him. That is not an answer. It was not meant to be. Several Marines exchanged amused looks. The conversation felt like trying to open a locked door with the wrong key. Every question produced another mystery. Every answer somehow revealed less information than before. Ethan studied the old veteran more carefully. The faded Marine cap, the weathered hands, the posture that still carried traces of discipline despite the passing years. Nothing about him suggested exaggeration. Nothing suggested someone inventing stories for attention. If anything, Walter seemed uncomfortable being the center of discussion. That made the strange call sign even more intriguing. Across the exhibit hall, a gunnery sergeant named Mason Cole had been listening while reviewing a display dedicated to Marine Corps history. At first, he paid little attention. Marines joked with veterans all the time. But the unusual name drifted across the room again. JUICEBOX. Mason frowned slightly. The word felt oddly familiar. Not familiar enough to place. Just familiar enough to bother him. He looked toward the group surrounding Walter Hayes. Ethan was still smiling. The younger Marines were still laughing. Walter was still refusing to explain anything. Mason narrowed his eyes. Somewhere deep in his memory, the strange call sign seemed connected to something he had heard years ago. He could not remember where. He could not remember when. But for the first time since the conversation began, someone in the museum stopped laughing. Captain Ethan Brooks was beginning to enjoy the mystery far more than he wanted to admit. The old Marine standing beside the photograph had answered every question without really answering any of them. Somehow that made the strange call sign feel larger each time it was mentioned. Around the exhibit hall, the group of Marines had grown. Some listened openly. Others pretended to study displays while keeping one ear turned toward the conversation. Walter Hayes seemed unaffected by all of it. His attention remained fixed on the photograph hanging on the wall. Ethan followed his gaze. You know somebody in that picture? Walter looked at the image for a moment. A few of them. The answer carried a quiet weight that immediately caught Ethan's attention. Friends. Walter nodded. Good ones. For the first time since the conversation began, nobody laughed. Something in the old veteran's voice had changed. Not dramatically. Just enough to remind everyone that behind every faded photograph stood real people and real memories. Ethan glanced back at the image. The young Marines in the picture looked impossibly confident. The sort of confidence only youth could produce. He looked at Walter again and tried to imagine which face might belong to him. It was harder than expected. Time had transformed everything. Were they part of the reason for the call sign? Ethan asked. Walter smiled faintly. Part of it. Several Marines leaned closer. Finally, it sounded like they might get a real answer. Instead, Walter looked back at the photograph and quietly added, the rest is not important. Groans and laughter immediately followed. Ethan threw his hands into the air. You are doing this on purpose now. Walter looked genuinely surprised. Doing what? Making everybody curious. The old Marine chuckled softly. That was never my plan. Across the room, Gunnery Sergeant Mason Cole continued watching. The strange feeling in the back of his mind had not disappeared. If anything, it had grown stronger. He moved closer to a nearby display case and studied a collection of old photographs while listening to the conversation. Somewhere in his career, he had heard that call sign before. He was certain of it now. The problem was remembering where. Ethan pointed toward Walter again. I still think it sounds ridiculous. Several Marines laughed. No offense, sir. None taken. Ethan grinned. I mean, imagine introducing yourself with that name. Walter nodded. That is why I rarely did. More laughter followed. Yet something unexpected happened. The old veteran laughed too. Not loudly. Not for attention. Just a brief smile shared with a memory nobody else could see. For a moment his eyes drifted back toward the photograph. The sunlight from the museum windows reflected softly across the glass covering the image. Suddenly, a fragment of memory surfaced. Bright daylight. 5 young Marines crowded into the back of a military transport vehicle. Exhaustion. Dust. Heat. Someone laughing uncontrollably. A small cardboard juice box held high like a trophy. The memory lasted less than a second before disappearing. Walter blinked and returned to the present. Nobody noticed except perhaps Mason Cole. The gunnery sergeant narrowed his eyes. The old man was not remembering a joke. He was remembering people. Ethan folded his arms again. Come on. One real explanation. Walter shook his head. No. Why? The answer came immediately. Because the people who earned that story are not here to tell it with me. The room became quiet. Even Ethan hesitated. The sentence landed differently than the others. It carried a kind of respect that did not invite further argument. Across the exhibit hall, Mason suddenly stopped walking. The words had triggered something. A conversation from years ago. An old briefing. A retired Marine officer mentioning a call sign so unusual that everyone remembered it. Mason felt a chill move through him. He slowly turned toward Walter Hayes. For the first time all afternoon, he was no longer wondering whether the story was real. Now he was wondering just how important it might be. Gunnery Sergeant Mason Cole stopped beside a display case and stared at nothing for several seconds. Around him, the museum continued operating as normal. Visitors moved between exhibits. Marines exchanged stories. Sunlight poured through the tall windows and painted long rectangles across the polished floor. Yet Mason barely noticed any of it. The strange call sign had settled into his memory like a missing puzzle piece, finally finding its place. Not completely. Not enough to explain everything, but enough to make him uncomfortable. Across the room, Captain Ethan Brooks remained determined to get answers. Walter Hayes stood quietly beside the photograph, showing no sign of wanting to leave and even less interest in explaining himself. Ethan shook his head with a smile. You know what the problem is? Walter looked at him. Several things come to mind. A few Marines laughed. Ethan pointed toward the old veteran. You answer every question in a way that creates 2 more questions. Walter considered that. That does happen sometimes. More laughter followed. The mood remained friendly, but the curiosity had become impossible to ignore. One Marine folded his arms. At this point, I think he enjoys watching us guess. Walter smiled faintly. I'm not nearly that entertaining. Ethan glanced toward the photograph again. Then at least tell us this. Was the name supposed to be funny? Walter looked at the image for a long moment. His eyes moved across faces frozen in time. Young Marines. Old friends. People who seemed only one step away from stepping out of the frame. Not originally, he said quietly. Ethan raised an eyebrow. So it became funny later? Walter nodded. Something like that. The answer only deepened the mystery. Mason slowly approached the group. His attention never left Walter. The old veteran looked exactly like he had when the conversation started. Calm, relaxed, patient. Yet Mason now felt increasingly certain that the man standing before them was connected to something far beyond an unusual nickname. Sir, Mason said carefully. Several Marines turned toward him. Ethan noticed the change in his tone immediately. It was the first serious voice anyone had used all afternoon. Walter looked up. Yes. Mason hesitated. Have you ever been stationed at Camp Pendleton? Walter nodded once. A long time ago. Lejeune. Yes. Mason felt his pulse quicken slightly. 29 palms. Walter smiled. Also yes. Ethan looked between them. What is going on? Mason ignored the question. Did anyone ever call you something else? Walter thought for a moment. A few things. Anything that people would recognize? The old Marine shook his head. Not anymore. The answer sent another chill through Mason. It sounded less like a joke and more like a statement about time itself. Ethan noticed the change in the gunnery sergeant's expression. You know something, do not you? Mason looked toward him. I am not sure. That is not convincing. Several Marines nodded in agreement. Mason exhaled slowly. I think I have heard that call sign before. The room immediately grew quieter. Ethan laughed once. See? I knew there was a story. But Mason did not laugh. He kept looking at Walter. The veteran simply stood there with the same calm expression he had worn all afternoon. No excitement. No concern. No sign that anything important had been said. That reaction unsettled Mason more than anything else. People usually reacted when someone recognized them. Walter Hayes acted like recognition was irrelevant. Across the exhibit hall, a flag hanging near the entrance shifted gently in the conditioned air. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed the passing hour. Mason made a decision. He pulled out his phone. Ethan immediately noticed. Who are you calling? Mason's eyes never left Walter. Someone who might know why that name sounds familiar. For the first time all afternoon, Captain Ethan Brooks stopped smiling. Mason Cole stepped away from the group and moved toward a quieter corner of the museum. The exhibits around him seemed strangely distant now. His attention was fixed entirely on the name echoing through his thoughts. JUICEBOX. The more he heard it, the more certain he became that it belonged somewhere important. He stopped beside a display honoring Marine Corps leadership and opened his phone. After a brief hesitation, he selected a contact he rarely called outside official matters. Master Gunnery Sergeant Richard Lawson, retired. If anyone would remember an obscure call sign from decades ago, it would be him. The line rang twice. Lawson. The voice sounded rough with age, but instantly recognizable. Master Guns, this is Mason Cole. Mason, what can I do for you? Mason glanced back across the museum. Walter Hayes still stood beside the old photograph, while Captain Ethan Brooks and the younger Marines watched him with growing curiosity. I have a strange question. Lawson laughed softly. Those are usually the interesting ones. Mason lowered his voice. Have you ever heard the call sign JUICEBOX? Silence answered him. Not confusion. Not amusement. Silence. Mason felt his stomach tighten. The retired Marine had not laughed. He had not asked Mason to repeat the name. Several long seconds passed before Lawson finally spoke. Where did you hear that? Mason looked toward Walter again. An old Marine visiting the museum. Another pause followed. This one felt heavier. Describe him. Mason did. White hair. Marine cap. Early 80s. Calm demeanor. The moment he finished, Lawson exhaled slowly. You are kidding. I wish I was. Mason straightened. You know who he is? Maybe. The answer came carefully. Too carefully. Mason could almost hear old memories turning behind the retired Marine's voice. What do you mean maybe? Lawson ignored the question. Did he tell you the call sign himself? Yes. And he actually admitted it? Mason frowned. Why would that matter? Another silence. Then a quiet chuckle. Because most people spent years trying to get that story out of him. Mason felt his pulse quicken. What story? Lawson laughed again, but there was no humor in it this time. Only respect. If it is the same man I am thinking of, that story belongs to a lot more people than him. Mason stared across the museum. Walter appeared completely ordinary. An elderly veteran quietly examining photographs. Yet every answer seemed to make him less ordinary. Who was he? Mason asked. Lawson responded immediately. The better question is who knew him. The answer only deepened the mystery. Mason leaned against the wall. Master Guns, I need more than that. The retired Marine sighed. Listen carefully. If that really is Walter Hayes, somebody higher than me should be involved. Mason blinked. Higher. Much higher. Across the museum floor, Captain Ethan Brooks had begun watching Mason's side of the room. He could tell the conversation was serious. The laughter from earlier had completely disappeared. Something about the situation had changed. Even the younger Marines sensed it. Lawson continued speaking. Do not make assumptions. Do not embarrass him. And do not assume that call sign is funny. Mason swallowed. Understood. Another pause followed. Then Lawson asked a question that caught him completely off guard. Is Lieutenant General Robert Kane still visiting the base this week? Mason frowned. As far as I know, yes. The retired Marine exhaled slowly. Good. Why? For the first time during the call, Lawson sounded completely certain. Because if that old Marine is who I think he is, General Kane is going to want to know he is standing in that museum right now. When the call ended, Mason lowered the phone and stared across the room at Walter Hayes. For the first time all afternoon, he was no longer searching for answers. He was waiting for confirmation. And, somewhere beyond the walls of the museum, A chain of events had already begun, moving faster than anyone inside realized. When Mason Cole returned to the center of the museum, the atmosphere felt different. Nothing obvious had changed. Visitors still moved through the exhibits. Marines still stood near display cases discussing history and tradition. Sunlight still streamed through the tall windows overlooking the parade grounds. Yet Mason now carried information nobody else possessed, and it changed the way he saw the room. Walter Hayes remained beside the old photograph, calm, patient, unbothered by the attention surrounding him. Captain Ethan Brooks immediately noticed Mason approaching. "Well," Ethan asked, "did you learn something?" Several Marines turned toward the gunnery sergeant. Their curiosity had only grown during his absence. Mason looked at Walter before answering. The old veteran met his eyes for a brief moment. There was no concern there, no nervousness, no curiosity. It was almost as if Walter already knew exactly how this story would unfold. "Not much," Mason said carefully. Ethan narrowed his eyes. "That is not what your face says." A few Marines nodded. Mason ignored them. "I spoke with someone who recognized the name." The room became noticeably quieter. Ethan folded his arms. "And?" Mason hesitated. "And he told me to stop treating it like a joke." The words landed harder than expected. Nobody laughed. Nobody even smiled. Ethan looked toward Walter again. For the first time since the conversation began, uncertainty appeared in his expression. "That still does not explain anything." "No," Mason agreed. "It does not." Walter remained silent. His attention drifted back toward the photograph hanging on the wall. The image seemed to hold him there. A frozen moment from another lifetime. Ethan followed his gaze. "You really are not going to tell us, are you?" Walter smiled faintly. "Tell you what?" Ethan sighed. "Anything." The old Marine chuckled softly. "That depends on the question." Several Marines exchanged amused looks. The answer somehow managed to be both friendly and completely unhelpful. Before Ethan could continue, Mason's phone vibrated. The sound seemed unusually loud in the quiet museum. He glanced at the screen. The message came from a senior administrative office attached to the base command staff. Mason read it once, then a second time. His pulse quickened slightly. Ethan immediately noticed. "What happened now?" Mason lowered the phone. "Nothing." "That means something happened." A few Marines nodded in agreement. Mason looked toward Walter again. The old veteran still appeared completely relaxed. He seemed more interested in the photograph than in the growing mystery surrounding himself. "A visitor is coming," Mason finally said. Ethan shrugged. "People visit the museum every day." Mason held his gaze. "Not this visitor." The answer stopped further questions. Across the room, museum staff suddenly became more active. One administrator walked quickly through the entrance and quietly spoke with another employee. A few moments later, a senior base representative arrived. Nobody announced anything. Nobody explained anything. Yet the subtle signs were impossible to miss. Something important was happening. Ethan felt it too. The confidence that had fueled the jokes earlier in the afternoon had begun fading. In its place was curiosity mixed with caution. Walter, meanwhile, appeared completely unchanged. He slowly removed his old Marine cap, brushed a small amount of dust from the brim, and placed it back on his head. The movement was simple, familiar, comfortable, like a man waiting for a bus rather than standing at the center of a mystery. Mason glanced toward the museum entrance. Beyond the glass doors, vehicles had begun arriving near the administrative section of the base. Staff members moved with unusual urgency. Phone calls were being made. Doors opened and closed. The chain of events started by a single unusual call sign was now moving far beyond the walls of the museum. Ethan looked from the entrance back to Walter Hayes. For the first time all afternoon, he found himself wondering whether the old Marine had known this would happen from the very beginning. The waiting became the hardest part. Nobody in the museum knew exactly who was coming, yet everyone could feel the change. In the air, conversations grew quieter. Visitors moved more slowly. Even the Marines who had laughed the loudest earlier now spoke in low voices. The mystery had evolved into something larger than curiosity. It had become anticipation. Captain Ethan Brooks stood near Walter Hayes with his arms folded, watching the entrance every few seconds. The old Marine, meanwhile, remained focused on the photograph that had held his attention for most of the afternoon. It was almost impossible not to notice the contrast. One man searched for answers. The other already seemed to know them. Ethan finally broke the silence. Did you know this was going to happen? Walter glanced at him. What? All of this? Ethan gestured toward the museum. The calls. The staff. The sudden attention. Walter smiled faintly. No. Ethan studied him carefully. You seem surprisingly calm. The old veteran looked back at the photograph. I have had a lot of practice. A few nearby Marines exchanged quiet smiles. The answer sounded simple, but somehow it carried far more meaning than the words themselves. Across the room, Gunnery Sergeant Mason Cole received another message. He read it quickly. This time there was no uncertainty. The visitor was no longer on the way. The visitor had arrived. Outside the museum, a small group of vehicles rolled to a stop near the entrance. Staff members moved into position. Senior personnel appeared from offices that had been quiet only an hour earlier. Through the glass windows, several Marines noticed the activity and turned toward the parking area. Ethan followed their gaze. His pulse quickened slightly. Whatever was happening had clearly moved beyond an ordinary visit. Mason slipped his phone back into his pocket and looked toward Walter. The old veteran had not moved. He simply stood beside the photograph with the same calm patience he had shown all day. For a moment, Mason wondered if Walter had spent his entire life handling situations exactly like this. Not seeking attention, not avoiding it, simply accepting whatever came next. The museum doors opened briefly as a senior base official stepped inside. He exchanged a few quiet words with administrative staff before moving aside. Nobody made an announcement. Nobody needed to. The room had already fallen almost completely silent. Ethan noticed something unexpected. Several older Marines visiting the museum had begun watching the entrance with expressions he could not quite read. Recognition, respect, perhaps both. It made the moment feel even heavier. Walter finally removed his hands from his jacket pockets. He adjusted the brim of his old Marine Corps cap and glanced once more at the photograph. His eyes rested briefly on the faces in the image. Young men frozen in another decade. Old friends. Old memories. Then he nodded almost imperceptibly, as though acknowledging someone only he could see. Ethan noticed the gesture. You really miss them, do not you? Walter looked at him. The faint smile returned. Every day. The answer was so honest that nobody responded. Across the museum floor, sunlight continued drifting slowly across the polished surface. Time seemed to stretch. Every second felt longer than the one before it. Then the entrance doors opened again. This time nobody looked away. Every Marine in the building instinctively straightened. Mason felt his heartbeat accelerate. Ethan took a slow breath. Walter remained exactly where he was. Calm. Unmoved. As though greeting an old chapter of his life rather than a powerful visitor. The figure entering the museum paused only briefly before scanning the room. Then, without hesitation, he began walking directly toward Walter Hayes. And in that moment, every person present realized the answer they had been chasing all afternoon was only a few steps away. The museum fell completely silent. Lieutenant General Robert Kane moved through the exhibit hall with the calm confidence of a man accustomed to commanding attention without asking for it. Senior staff followed several steps behind, but their presence barely registered. Every eye in the room remained fixed on the general himself. Captain Ethan Brooks instinctively straightened his posture. So did every Marine nearby. Yet something immediately felt unusual. General Kane was not looking at the displays. He was not acknowledging the museum staff. He was not speaking with the officers who had accompanied him. His eyes were focused on one person, Walter Hayes. The distance between them disappeared quickly. The old veteran remained beside the photograph, hands resting comfortably at his sides. There was no surprise in his face. No nervousness. No anticipation. Only recognition. When the general finally stopped in front of him, a faint smile appeared. It was not the formal smile of a senior officer greeting a retired Marine. It was something much older than rank. You still wear that cap. The room remained frozen. Walter looked up and smiled. You still arrive with an audience. A few senior staff members exchanged glances. The familiarity was impossible to miss. General Kane laughed softly. Some habits survive retirement. Walter nodded. Apparently so. Nobody else moved. Nobody spoke. Captain Brooks could hardly believe what he was witnessing. The most senior officer he had ever met was standing in front of an old man everyone had been joking about less than an hour earlier. The general looked at the photograph beside Walter. His expression softened. I have not seen that picture in years. Walter glanced toward it. Neither have I. For a brief moment, neither man said anything. The silence felt meaningful rather than awkward, like two people sharing a memory nobody else could see. Then General Kane looked directly at Walter and extended his hand. Good to see you again, JUICEBOX. The effect was immediate. Every remaining whisper in the museum vanished. Captain Brooks felt his stomach drop. Around him, Marines stared in disbelief. The general had not hesitated. He had not questioned the name. He had not laughed at it. He had spoken it with complete certainty and unmistakable respect. Walter reached out and shook his hand. Good to see you too, General. The handshake lasted only a moment, but it carried the weight of decades. Ethan glanced toward Mason Cole. The gunnery sergeant looked no less stunned than anyone else. General Kane stepped back slightly and studied the old veteran. I was beginning to think you would never visit this place again. Walter looked around the museum. I was passing through. The general laughed. That sounds exactly like you. Several Marines exchanged confused looks. The conversation sounded less like a reunion and more like the continuation of a discussion paused years earlier. Ethan finally found his voice. Sir. General Kane turned toward him. Yes, Captain. Ethan hesitated. The question suddenly felt far more important than before. You know him? A few Marines quietly shifted closer. The general looked at Walter for a moment before answering. Then a smile crossed his face. Not amusement. Respect. Deep respect. Know him? King glanced back toward the photograph on the wall. Captain, there was a time when half the people I trusted most answered when somebody called that name. The room went silent again. Walter looked away as if the attention embarrassed him. The general noticed and shook his head with a quiet chuckle. Some things never change. For the first time all afternoon, nobody was laughing at the call sign anymore. Now they were trying to understand why a single word had just changed the entire room. For several moments after the general spoke, nobody in the museum said a word. The silence felt different now. Earlier it had been curiosity. Now it was understanding beginning to take shape. Captain Ethan Brooks looked from General Kane to Walter Hayes and back again. The same call sign that had seemed ridiculous only an hour earlier now carried a weight nobody could ignore. Ethan cleared his throat. Sir, if you do not mind me asking, where did the name come from? General Kane smiled. The question seemed to pull him backward through time. He glanced at Walter, who immediately shook his head. You do not have to. Kane laughed softly. That is exactly why I am going to. A few Marines smiled nervously. The general folded his hands behind his back and looked toward the old photograph hanging on the wall. Many years ago, a group of young Marines spent a very long time operating far from home. Long days, longer nights. Everyone was tired. Everyone was carrying more responsibility than they cared to admit. His eyes drifted toward Walter. One afternoon, supplies finally reached them. Not the important supplies. Not the equipment. Just a small box of juice drinks that somehow survived the trip. Several Marines exchanged confused glances. The story sounded almost absurdly ordinary. Kane smiled. Most people ignored them. Walter did not. A faint grin appeared on the old veteran's face. The general continued. He spent the next hour making sure every Marine around him got one before he took one himself. A few Marines laughed softly. That was it? Ethan asked. Kane nodded. That was it. The captain blinked. That is how he got the name? Not exactly. The general looked around the room. The name stayed because it became a reminder. No matter how difficult things became, no matter how tired people were, Walter always paid attention to the people around him. He remembered small things when everyone else focused on big ones. The museum remained quiet. Kane's voice softened. Years later, when people talked about trust, leadership, and looking after your fellow Marines, they talked about him. Walter looked mildly uncomfortable with the attention. You are making it sound larger than it was. The general smiled. No, you just spent 50 years pretending it was smaller. A few Marines chuckled. Ethan looked at Walter differently now. Not as a mystery. Not as a story. As a person. A man who had quietly carried a reputation built on character rather than recognition. The captain took a slow breath. Sir, he said, looking at Walter, I owe you an apology. The old Marine waved a hand dismissively. For what? Ethan almost laughed. You know for what. Walter smiled. Captain, if I remembered every joke someone made about me, I would not have room to remember anything else. The answer earned genuine laughter throughout the room. Not mocking laughter. warm laughter, respectful laughter. General Kane looked around at the gathered Marines. The reason some names survive is not because they sound impressive. They survive because of the people attached to them. His gaze settled briefly on Walter. And some of the best Marines I have ever known never spent a day trying to become legends. The sunlight outside had begun turning golden. Long shadows stretched across the museum floor. Walter glanced once more at the photograph on the wall. Then he adjusted his old Marine cap and started toward the exit. Nobody stopped him. Nobody needed to. As he passed Ethan, the captain nodded respectfully. Walter returned the gesture and continued walking. Near the doorway, he paused for a moment and looked back at the photograph one final time. Then he stepped into the evening sunlight and disappeared beyond the glass doors. The museum remained quiet long after he left, because everyone there understood something they had not understood that morning. The names people laugh at often hide stories they could never imagine.